Hello and welcome to the Athena 40 podcast, Bouncing Back. I'm Elizabeth Filippouli, founder of Athena 40, an international platform promoting female leadership and connecting individuals from around the world to exchange knowledge and insights. In this podcast, we are interviewing thought leaders, entrepreneurs, and decision makers. We're bringing you insights related to developments triggered by the coronavirus crisis, and we speak with pioneering women from across different industries and countries. COVID-19 is indiscriminate. It has made us aware that regardless of race, gender, religion, and status, we are all vulnerable to contracting the virus. Governments and populations are taking precautions to protect populations with higher fatality rates. Although containing the virus is the key priority, measures should be considered on how to combat the ways in which COVID-19 is likely to aggravate the already existing social, political, and economic inequalities in our societies. My guest today is Miriam Sfair, Director of the Arab Institute for Women in Lebanon, and we're going to discuss the situation in Lebanon as it has unfolded over the last few months. Miriam, welcome to Bouncing Back.
Good morning, and I'm very happy to be here.
Would you like to tell us about your work at the Arab Institute for Women? You are partners of Athena 40 and you organized an excellent panel discussing women's issues in Lebanon just before everything started to shut down in the beginning of March. I would like to ask you to tell us a bit and tell our audience a bit about the exact mandate of the Arab Institute for Women.
As you said, we are partnered with Athena, and we're very, very happy to be partnering with you in general and on the very successful event that we did. So if I am to start, the Arab Institute for Women at the Lebanese American University was established in 1973. The purpose of establishing it was to preserve LAU's legacy as a college for women. So prior to the establishment of the Institute, LAU was a college that accepted only women. And then in 1973, to honor this legacy, when LAU started becoming a co-educational institution, the Institute was founded. The Institute is the first of its kind in Lebanon and the region. So it's the first, and it's one of the first globally. So at the Institute, we work at the intersection of academia and activism, and the Institute is an attestation and a testimony to LAU's commitment to women and girls. And this was a vision ahead of its time for the region and globally. So at the Institute, we promote interdisciplinary education and research, and the view is always to social change and policy change. We create and share knowledge on women and gender issues. We try to build partnerships like the ones we have with you and form strategic collaborations to address violence against women in all its forms and all issues related to gender justice. We provide capacity building and continuing education programming that focuses on women and gender. We try as much as we can to connect academicians and practitioners working where we try to create a space for women at the table. We try as much as we can also to engage in global dialogues like the one today on women and gender issues and try to raise awareness and rally for action. And bringing stakeholders to advance these issues is something not easy. And we try as much as we can to do that through shared discussion and shared agenda so that we don't duplicate whatever is happening out there. So this is in a nutshell what we do. We always stand at the platform of equality, human rights, and social justice, and we try as much as we can to support the next generation of activists and agents of change, especially the students and the youth and our students here at LAU. We try to mainstream gender and to highlight the importance of gender equality as a human rights principle and a condition for sustainable development. So this is very briefly what we do, and we hope that in light of this COVID-19 crisis, we try as much as we can globally to consolidate our efforts to try and bring about more gender justice, especially at a time when gender equality and women within the context of this global pandemic are suffering the most.
You have a very dynamic presence, and your conversations are always very timely, but also you engage people who are influencers in your society, and you're trying to find solutions for the many and very complex issues that the Lebanese society has been dealing with for decades now. Let's go back a few months ago when this massive uprising broke out in Lebanon. If I'm not mistaken, it was October 17, 2019.
Yes.
People joined forces, they took to the streets to reject the domination of oligarchs. For someone to try and understand, of course, the wider context, would have to navigate all the contradictions and manifestations of violence of the past 3 decades in Lebanon, really about, what has been happening in the post-war era. So to separate military occupations, how different new trends permeated society and the modus operandi of the people, the governments, and they resulted into trends like, or phenomena like clientelism, neoliberalism. So it's a very complex situation, which you would be certainly want to explain to us a bit more as to what happened, where are we now, 6-7 months after those uprisings began, and of course at the heart of the COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah, so if I am to talk about what happened on the level of gender rights and how women took the streets, so if I am to talk in terms of the global picture, so as we have seen, Arab women have been the face and the force of revolutions that called for change across the Arab region. We saw Ala Salah, and a lot of other women, so from Sudan to Iraq to Tunisia to Libya to Palestine to Syria to Yemen and Lebanon. And if I am to focus on Lebanon, so Lebanese women have always been very vocal in terms of leading the fight for change and trying to basically get their rights, irrespective of the fact of the society wanting to give them these rights or not. So we've been plagued with, like all countries and like all Arab countries and even globally, we've been plagued by sexism, sexual harassment, gender threats, a lot of violations regarding our rights. And this revolution was no different. So when people took the streets, this revolution was called a feminist and a feminine revolution, a feminist actually revolution. And women were called in Arabic al-mar'a thawra, so women is revolution, etc. Simply because women's presence was as felt as men's presence, and women have always been there. It's not something novel. We are calling for whatever our foremothers have called for previously. So there was actually 6 very clear demands that the women on the streets wanted. They wanted to revoke the personal status law and wanted a civil law that governs the lives and everything that falls under. So personal status codes have to do with marriage, child custody, divorce, and inheritance. And those women were calling for a civil state where all women are treated equally and are treated equally under civil law and not personal status laws. They were calling for imposing a quota system in parliament simply because we are there and we are voicing our concerns all the time. But in terms of decision-making powers, we do not have decision-making powers. The number of women in government are few. Now, after the revolution and when the new government came forth, there were 6 women that became ministers, but that is not having women in numbers. That does not mean that women will actually call for change in terms of women's rights or countering the hegemonic masculinity and all the agendas that were calling for patriarchy and all that. So it's playing the gender card in terms of bringing women, token women who would pledge allegiance to the current system and how it is, with no feminist perspective whatsoever, that doesn't translate into policies that are in favor of women, is something that we do not want. We need to reform discriminatory policies that have been around for so long. And we don't just want women to do that, we want women and men to do that. So we need women who are there and who are actually calling for change in terms of women's rights and human rights. And by calling for imposing a quota system in a country that's obsessed with quotas. So in Lebanon, we have quotas for everything. So why not have quotas for women? Also, another demand on the street was to amend the nationality law that's very discriminatory against women and does not allow women to pass their nationality neither to their husbands nor to their children. This has been a battle for ages, and there have been a lot of draft laws that were submitted to amend the nationality law. Unfortunately, nothing has happened. Another thing that women's rights group were calling for was basically to improve the situation of women vis-a-vis everything related to gender-based violence and domestic violence, and to improve the current law on domestic violence and to make it better, to make it more respectful of human rights, and to make it more strict in terms of the punishment that men receive when they violate against women's rights and gender rights, to remove the clause that condones marital rape and think that this is something that's normal. So basically, and to address everything related to sexual and reproductive health and rights, to address the issue of sexual orientation and gender identity. Another demand was to abolish the kafala system. So as you know, migrant domestic workers that actually work in Lebanon are basically burdened by a kafala system that's very unfair, that render domestic workers mere prisoners in their employers' houses, and they have no chance of ridding themselves of employers if they happen to fall in the hands of the wrong people. Their passports are confiscated, their work contracts are very discriminatory sometimes. There is no way of determining if those migrant domestic workers have basically access to their salary or not, to their days off or not. And as you said, COVID-19 came and changed the landscape, even like magnified those discriminatory practices even more.
Before we get to the COVID-19, I wanted to ask you something with regards to the nature of those demands, which are, of course, very rightful demands. I still remember one of the women protests quote, which was something like, "Our revolution in Lebanon is feminist, not only because it seeks transformative change, but also because it is intersectional." And it is intersectional in the sense that it is seeking to end multiple forms of oppression, not simply economic inequalities.
True.
And of course, I would like you to comment on that and whether you agree and why.
Okay, so previously, a lot of there was a split, if you want, and split has always been there. It's as if human rights are present in a basket, and you can pick and choose whatever you want and whatever suits you in terms of human rights. The revolution managed to break all the barriers in terms of intersectionality simply because the whole groups that went down on the streets were groups that believed in intersectionality and believed in how intersectionality infiltrates all aspects of our lives. So we had migrant domestic workers with us, we had the refugee women, we had the LGBTIQ community walk with us, we had women demanding for the rights of trans women, and we had women from all walks of life partaking in this revolution, calling for civil laws and the removal of all religious laws, and for us to be all governed by the same laws. So basically, unfortunately, the COVID-19 came, and a lot of things, people went back to home simply because of the fear of this pandemic. But definitely, it was not a revolution that was calling for just the right of women to vote and the right of women's economic participation. No, women's economic participation and the most marginalized of those women who are living in Lebanon, who are migrant domestic workers. So we cannot pick and choose what rights we want to call for. We have to call for the rights of Palestinian women who are living in Lebanon. We have to call for the rights of women who are unable to give the nationality to their children, even though their children were born in Lebanon, speak the Lebanese dialect better than any other dialect. And this was very intersectional in terms of like the rights of all and excluding nobody, leaving nobody behind.
So what are the lessons that the world can take from the Lebanese uprisings, which perhaps could inform struggles against capitalism, against sectarianism, against neoliberalism and the state worldwide?
You know, we have a long way to go in terms of Lebanon. I don't know if we can give lessons, but what we learned is that this should be a collective goal. We don't want one head to decide on everything. It was a revolution where a lot of people were deciding everything, and that's why it continued. It was a revolution that called for learning from the lessons of the past. For instance, a lot of the talks that happened on the streets at the time of revolution, there were university professors who moved their classes to the streets. They were activists that talked about the war and the war years and what happened during the war and how we shouldn't continue and shouldn't move on and learn from the lessons of the past. You know, a lot of people and a lot of the talks that happened served as transitional justice measures. In Lebanon, no transitional justice happened after the war. And those talks on the streets calling for a civil code and a civil society whereby all the laws that govern us are civil, and reminiscing everything that happened in the past and capitalizing on it never happening again. And for instance, highlighting the fact that we need to know what happened to the loved ones of those who are missing or disappeared in Lebanon, or the fact that a lot of people sat and talk about sectarianism and how bad it is and how we need to move on to basically a secular state that basically looks upon the positive things that might come out of it and all the negative things all the negative baggage that we carry as a result of confessionalism and sectarianism. So I personally think we need to move forward and we need to capitalize on the youth. So this revolution was led by the youth, and it's important to keep in mind that the youth are the future, and we need to capitalize on the fact that we need to raise them not to be sectarian individuals and to be individuals that value and appreciate human rights and gender justice.
Miriam, there is worldwide condemnation for the brutal death of George Floyd in Minneapolis under the US police forces. And that, of course, has generated a tsunami of protests across different cities worldwide. Of course, it is about racism. Of course, it is about discrimination. So very much the topics that you have been talking about today. This is a very brutal world, and it has been hit by the COVID-19 shock, of course, which has impacted and is going to impact really badly our economies. How do you see the connection between, injustice, discrimination, ongoing racism, and of course the economic impact that impoverishes people?
So as you said, yes, if you look at this crisis, it becomes obvious that we are all globally affected in more or less the same manner, depending on your geographical location. So there are very common trends that we saw. For instance, violence against women has increased everywhere. Racist behaviors have increased everywhere. Healthcare workers have been burdened, and in most, at least in Lebanon, the highest percentage of healthcare workers are women. So they've been affected more than men. Everything has moved to online. So all the information that you get is via online platforms. All the information that you send out is via online platforms. We are working from home. I'm currently working from home. Of course, you are too. So everything that is happening within the confines of a home. What happens in terms of racial or gender-based violence or violence against women or domestic violence in specific is that you're in a context that is toxic. The home is no longer a safe haven. The violator is no longer going out. The employer is no longer going out. You are in a context whereby you don't have the privileges that you had in terms of maybe having a bit of space for you. You are burdened with everything related to domestic work, childcare, doing homework at home, attending to all the needs of the elderly, for instance, etc. So this pandemic has exacerbated everything that we know, that we already received backlash against. So, for instance, if I give you an example in terms of Lebanon, a lot of people, we have an economic crisis in Lebanon, and a lot of people will be losing their job, but mostly women will be losing most of the jobs simply because they are the most vulnerable. Over and above that, if we also take the example of Lebanon in terms of, let's say, this lockdown, women who have lost custody of their children and have visitation rights were not able previously, now the lockdown is being eased, were not able, for instance, to see their children simply because of the lockdown in specific. Also, migrant domestic workers who are home and who usually had a break where the employers would leave the home have no longer this break. They no longer have a day off simply because there was a lockdown. They are no longer maybe getting their salaries in terms of dollars as a result of the crisis in Lebanon. So in general, female labor participation is relatively low in the Arab world with it has reached 19% in 2019 for women as opposed to 8% for men. And with the spread of this virus, a lot of women will be losing their jobs. And I don't have the statistics for Lebanon, but what I'm trying to say is that this has implications on a lot of people, mostly women and mostly vulnerable groups. So the more vulnerable you are in the chain, the less privileges you are, and the more you are losing, and the more human rights violation and all sorts of violation are happening to you. And it's very unfortunate what's happening in the US. And what I want to say is that, unfortunately, when you have an unfair situation, this has bottled up. So there is unfairness and things are bottling up, and you get a huge tornado effect as a result of this unfairness that's happening. And you think it's funny how the most vulnerable are the ones that are affected as a result of a war, a pandemic, an emergency, a crisis, etc.
Do you think that through this shock, the COVID-19 shock, and the ripple effect that is going to leave as a legacy behind for definitely, the next year or longer ahead of us, do you think that it's going to change us as people, as individuals, as citizens, as leaders? So basically, are we going to become more accountable, or do you see the same inequalities being exacerbated even? Do you still see people as a race, as human race? Unfortunately, we're being characterized by greed, by imperialism, by this natural need, shall I call it a need or inclination to conquer, to instead of acting out of solidarity, collaboration, and supporting each other, we see more negativity. And that is not a recent phenomenon. That's been, as you well know, over the centuries. Could this global shock that has attacked everyone's life and all our societies change us to the better?
I would want to hope so, to be honest with you. I would wish this would happen. If we take the example of the environment, for instance, I don't know if you know, but we don't take good care of our environment in Lebanon, and we had a garbage crisis, and we have a lot of issues related to the environment. So there is conscious effort on the part of organizations in Lebanon to try and encourage people to be more environmentally conscious, to stop projects that pollute the environment and bring about negative results in terms of polluting the water, in terms of polluting the air, in terms of raising your own crops, etc. So I hope things will change. I don't know if we're going to be learning from this pandemic, simply because I think it's high time that we appreciate what we have, and we think in terms of how can we sustain ourselves better without this greed of making more money or using the environment in our favor. Like in Lebanon, for instance, we have been adopting a model whereby one day a certain plate number of cars take the streets, the other another plate card, and this has reduced a lot the pollution, and it has allowed, for instance, in terms of like women working from home, women to work from home, to be able to have more flex hours, to be able to, some women are very, very happy with this setup whereby they work 3 days, for instance, from the office now. This is going to be happening now, and 2 days from home. And this has created a balance in terms of their ease, in terms of like handling stuff related to a household and negotiating with their partner what to do in terms of household chores now that she has more flexible time for her to go into the office or not go to the office. So it depends how you're seeing it. I personally think we need to look into the positive aspects of this crisis. What has it brought in terms of like positive aspects, and to look at the negative and try to counter it. So say, for instance, we now know that there are creative ways of basically countering gender-based violence, where women, if they're not able, for instance, to report by using the phone, can use social media and online and use Facebook and send the message to their friend, whereby they can report, for instance, a violation. Also, in terms of judges are being more creative in terms of rulings, even though courts are closed nowadays as a result of the lockdown. A lot of judges are doing their rulings over the phone. A lot of counseling for victims of gender-based violence are done over the phone. So we're trying as much as we can to cater for marginalized groups. For instance, if we take the example of the LGBTIQ community and how, for instance, in terms of lockdown and them being in closed spaces with transphobic family members, they run the risk of abuse. So now we're trying to, civil society organizations are trying to basically have safe houses for the LGBTIQ community, so that previously we didn't have safe houses. You get what I mean? Or at least we didn't hear of safe houses. So we're trying creatively to basically counter, to work things differently and to use, if you want, loopholes in the system to try and bring about change. So I think there's a lot to be learned, and the more time passes by, the more I think we'll get more creative in terms of like finding solutions to these problems.
And we need to continue those conversations and engaging people who are able and care to make things happen and to promote social change. And so I'm really glad to have the opportunity to speak to you, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to keep doing things with the Arab Institute for Women in Lebanon. And I really look forward to the next event together, Miriam.
It's a pleasure. Let's hope the positive normal that we know goes back to the way it is.
Let's hope so, and let us hope that we will create a better new normal.
Yeah, we capitalize on the efforts of organizations like Athena to like continue these global dialogues, so that we all know what's happening over the world, and we know how best to learn from the experiences of countries that have made a change or have succeeded. If you look globally, a lot of the countries where women are leaders, at least this is what we hear, have managed to curb everything related to the negative effects of COVID-19. And this is something that we need to really look into, simply because I think when women are in power, they do things better and they do things differently.
For sure. And this is because by nature, there is compassion, there is this inner emotional intelligence, and these two virtues, I think, are much needed for our world today. Miriam Sfair, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
Thanks to you, and good luck in all the endeavors, and keep safe, please.
Thank you. And thank you for listening to the Athena 40 podcast, Bouncing Back. Stay tuned, more episodes coming up. Please feel free to subscribe. Athena 40, is hosting conversations with thought leaders, entrepreneurs, influencers, and decision makers from all over the world in this effort to find our new normal. You can find more information on us on athena40forum.com. Follow us on Twitter on Athena_40. Stay safe, stay inspired.